welcome to the Theology Mill podcast from Whitfenstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I work here at Whitfenstock, and I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, come stop by our website at whitfenstock.com. So in this episode, which is it's actually the second of 3 interviews in our Apocalyptic Paul Booth, in which we're trying to give you guys kind of an introductory engagement with some apocalyptic readings of the Apostle Paul in this stream of interpretation called Pauline Apocalyptic. Putting that stream also, though, into conversation with other schools of interpreting Paul, as well as Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature, and even some contemporary systematic theology and philosophy. On this particular episode, I got to talk with Dr. Susan Grove Eastman, who is the Associate Research Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Duke Divinity School. She's also an Episcopal priest with 2 decades of pastoral experience to boot. She's the author of numerous books on Paul, most recently including Recovering Paul's Mother Tongue, Language, and Theology in Galatians, which we published the 2nd edition of at Whitfenstock a couple years ago. Along with a soon forthcoming book called Oneself in Another, Participation and Personhood in Pauline Theology, which is also coming out with Cascade here soon. And then on top of all of that, a forthcoming interpretation commentary on Romans. So now I want to say thanks very much for listening to our show, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, so I am here with Dr. Susan Grove Eastman. It's a real honor, and we are sharing a drink over a phone call, toasting through the airwaves, I guess you could say. And so what I'm drinking, I have so I just interviewed Douglas Herring a few days ago, and I was a bit ashamed to admit to him that I was drinking some Starbucks, just because it was an emergency and that was the only coffee I had. But this morning I have a much better, much more enjoyable cup of coffee. I have Ethiopian light roast, the French pressed, and it's from a coffee company here called Water Avenue that I really like, that one of my buddies used to work at. So I am enjoying that. Very happy to be drinking that because it's 7:30 here, so it's not only waking me up, but it tastes good as well. What about you, Susan? What are you drinking?
I'm drinking Keurig coffee from the faculty and staff lounge here at the Divinity School at Duke. But you are so clearly located in the Pacific Northwest. I can hear it in everything you're saying.
Yeah.
I used to live in Oregon, so I know.
Oh, okay. So you know the coffee snobbery well, probably.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, so let's dig into Apocalyptic Paul. So if you could, I know this is a large question, but if you could kind of sum up Apocalyptic Paul, that reading of Paul sort of in a nutshell, how would you describe it? Or I guess another way to frame the question would be, how would you explain it if you were teaching sort of an intro intro course in seminary on Pauline Apocalyptic? How would you kind of go about on your first day, sort of laying out the contours of it?
Well, I'll be very brief because we have a nice, long, interesting list of things to discuss. But I would say that the word apocalypse means unveiling. So it is in its primary usage about revelation, the unveiling in that sense, and that Paul uses the noun apocalypse and the verb, which we don't have in English, to apocalypse, to reveal, to unveil. But because unveiling when it comes to God and revelation when it comes to God always have a transforming power, apocalypse and apocalyptic have the sense of God's power not only being unveiled, but coming into the world in new ways. And so that sense, because it is, Douglas Campbell says this actually very briefly in his one of his books. The revelation of God means the revelation comes from God and does not evolve out of human history. It is God's act at all times, and as such, it is powerful to save and redeem God's people and to redeem the whole world. So part of talking about quote-unquote apocalyptic Paul is to emphasize this emphasis that the line of movement always comes from God to us. And that actually is quite powerful and transforming when understood to be what the gospel is about. And that, of course, that this has happened in the incarnate, crucified, and resurrected Christ, uniquely and with cosmic as well as personal consequences. This is situated in the context with similarities and differences of Jewish texts and traditions that are categorized as apocalyptic, often because they refer to divine conflict with the powers of evil, to divine victory over evil, sometimes to the end of the world, which is what apocalyptic tends to mean in modern secular usage, to this power struggle on a cosmic level between God and the forces of evil. I've already said that. That has a sense of divine power, divine inbreaking. We can nuance that a bit. And also both spatial visions of God and sometimes temporal aspects to how that's happening. And there are a lot of apocalyptic visionary texts, like our book of Revelation in the New Testament, in Second Temple Jewish literature as well. So that's another way in which apocalyptic Paul is situated in the guild of Pauline scholars. And the third way is to talk in conversation with theologians who are interested in this topic.
That's a great little overview. Thank you for that. Okay, so how does Pauline Apocalyptic differ from other ways of reading Paul then? Because I know that it's not the only way to read Paul.
It highlights the cosmological scope of Paul's proclamation of the gospel and worldview, which has interesting immediate consequences in terms of, for example, highlighting how Paul talks about sin as a cosmic power of some sort and not simply or primarily individual human actions and decisions. That would be one example of the difference that makes. It highlights the themes of conflict in Paul, which are there, and doesn't sweep them under the rug, so to speak. It highlights Paul sometimes in conversation with other Jewish apocalyptic texts. It highlights the newness of the gospel and there are variations on the degrees to which people do this, but that God in Christ is doing something radically new, that is not simply evolving out of the history of God's dealings with Israel, God's work in the world. The gospel does not evolve out of the present. It comes to us from the future, so to speak. That would be another way of speaking about this from some apocalyptic interpreters of Paul. So those are some of the ways.
Yeah, thank
These are
you.
emphases. They're matters of emphasis and debate.
Right.
All of them.
Right. Yeah. So, okay, one thing that as I've tried to familiarize myself with this conversation that's been a bit confusing to me is why Pauline apocalyptic and not like biblical apocalyptic or just Christian apocalyptic. So I guess my question is how does Pauline apocalyptic how is it distinct from other forms of biblical apocalyptic, whether what you find in the Hebrew Bible or in the Johannine corpus? Like what makes it specifically Pauline, would you say?
Well, that's a good question because one of the direction that we could needs more exploration, say, is how Paul's apocalyptic gospel is similar to the Gospels, for example, or the Book of Revelation. Jamie Davies is saying that we should do that, and I think he's right. So what would be distinct in Paul would be what's distinct in Paul anyway, I guess.
Sure, sure.
So the way in which Paul talks about the law is one of the ways in which he really tends to stand out from, particularly differs from, say, Matthew. But and if we put that in an apocalyptic context and we begin to think about the law as taken in hand or taken over by sin and used contrary to the law's purposes by sin, well, that's pretty distinctive to Paul, I think. That would be one example. But I guess I would not tend to say, oh, let's go to apocalyptic Paul and then see what's distinctive about that versus, this is a huge conversation. I don't feel prepared to talk about, say, apocalyptic themes in the Gospel of Mark. And that would go into discussions about how he treats the law, how he thinks about continuity and discontinuity in relationship to Israel or the promises to Israel, even those in history and salvation, how he thinks about the end of the world. These would be topics one would explore, I would think, among many others, to try to tease that out. That's a big topic.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so as far as kind of situating or mapping the apocalyptic Paul in terms of sort of the history of this development of interpreting Paul, who would you say are some of sort of the major figures? And what would you say? I know this is also a really big question, but what would you say are some of their sort of distinctive contributions?
Well, I just tell people to read Jamie Davies' book, which I'm plugging, but
Thank you.
Apocalyptic Paul, because it's a fabulous, brief, very clear, very fair introduction to all of this. Major players in the Apocalyptic Paul, we could go behind Käsemann, but I'll start with Ernst Käsemann, who was extremely influential for J. Lewis Martyn. But Käsemann highlighted over against his teacher Bultmann was the cosmic scope of Paul's gospel. On the theological side, I would say that Karl Barth is the major theological influencer. J. Lewis Martyn emphasized discontinuity over continuity even more than his teacher Kasemann, or his mentor Casemann. He emphasized he talked about theological continuity and anthropological discontinuity. I've criticized him for that. He talked about the line of movement from God to us, which I think is exactly right. Christian Beker is another one who also his work has not continued to receive attention, but he said that apocalyptic was at the center of Paul's thought. So if you want to read that, you can read that. More recently, the genealogy, Beverly Gaventa, to some degree myself, Alexander Brown, Lisa Bowens. These are all people who've continued to pursue apocalyptic interpretations of Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm curious, who was the first of these folks that you read yourself? Like, how did you sort of first discover Pauline Apocalyptic?
Well, it was through Lou Martyn, and then I read Casemann. And years and years ago, I was not ever a student of Lou Martyn, but I participated in a study group, the Paul study group, that he led at Union Theological Seminary. So that's where I began to really hear about apocalyptic and Paul, and hear apocalyptic used as a noun, which it is not.
Right, right.
Yeah. And
Okay.
then, yeah, he was my intro.
Okay, awesome. But yeah, speaking of Käsemann and Martyn, you often cite both of them pretty positively in your work. So how would you say that each of them has influenced you in a special way?
Well, Martyn really was a mentor to me. And what I got from Martyn and his wife Dorothy Martyn, who did psychology, child development psychology, and thought about it theologically. Above all, what I got from them was grace as a transforming power in human lives, and that has so much larger than the self or than human beings, and yet operates internal to human beings, and yet exceeds us. I got that from both Lou and Dorothy Martyn, especially. But I think that's also in Käsemann. And I think for Käsemann, so these are because of my anthropological interests, what really influenced me from them. Käsemann threaded the needle remarkably between the individual and personal and cosmic scope and consequences of Paul's gospel as the power of God breaking into human history in a new way. And so his work in that regard, especially for my interests, was really and remains really, really important. And Käsemann also, more than Martyn, maintained some awareness of a history, although it's truly it's a history of promise that looks discontinuous, and is discontinuous from the human side. It looks like a disaster, as Käsemann famously said, and I love that in Käsemann, his kind of acerbic naming of the disasters of human history, refusal to ever get sentimental or naive or indulge in some kind of a narrative of progress, human progress from below. Käsemann will not do that, nor will I. I don't buy that. I think it's destructive.
Yeah.
So those are ways in which I'm just kind of brainstorming here, influenced me. I'm sure there are many, many more.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's great. Okay, so yeah, since we have talked a bit about sort of the cosmic scope in Pauline Apocalyptic, I want to ask how Pauline Apocalyptic might change the way we think about forces like sin and salvation or death and life, and how does this sort of stream of thinking sort of go about zooming out, so to speak, to a more cosmological lens of human life.
Right. You can track this really well in Romans, as many have written. And so one way of reading Paul, which is not the apocalyptic way, puts the focus on human guilt, individual human guilt for individual human sins, understood as human decisions and actions. And the salvation is that Christ has borne the consequence of that, the punishment, the condemnation, so that we do not have to, and we are freed, forgiven, and freed from that condemnation. The cosmological scope of apocalyptic readings of Paul there are debates about this, whether that notion of individual human responsibility and guilt remains in Paul. I think it does, but not everybody does. But it frames it within a cosmic understanding of sin as something that has power in the cosmos. and takes humanity and even the law captive for lethal ends. And the way one sees this in Romans is in 3:9, Paul says, I've already charged that all are under sin. And then in 5:12, on through the end of chapter 7, he talks about sin coming into the world and holding humanity captive. And in 7, using the law in a lethal way. And so that salvation becomes a matter of liberation from something larger than the self. And human beings are understood to be slaves of sin apart from God's action in Christ. So that's the cosmic scope, how it zooms out to the cosmological lens. And that then affects all kinds of things, everything from how one deals with questions about kids who think that now you can do anything. The argument against the gospel, against grace, that if you tell people that they're forgiven, they'll just go out and sin all the more so they can be forgiven all the more. But if we understand sin as slavery, then sin isn't exercising freedom. We're not free to sin.
Right.
The exercise of freedom, it is in fact a symptom of the exercise of our bondage from which we need liberation. So alcoholism is never a free choice. Right, so all of that is the way in which the cosmological framing of sin and salvation, one of the ways in which it functions, but it also functions to say that instead of thinking of sin in terms of, or only in terms of individual human decisions, we can think of sin in terms of the bondage of the human race that results in abuse, in racism, in inequity and injustice, and salvation as encompassing liberation from those, among many others, symptoms of sin on a social level as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, are there any blind spots, would you say, in Pauline Apocalyptic, or areas that you think kind of need more refining, or maybe just new or different directions you think it should head towards?
Well, I would say that I really think that, well, there are certain dichotomous ways of thinking that need more nuance, for sure. I've just named one that, rather than saying that sin can only be understood as and I don't use the term cosmic power because that begins to sound Manichaean. I think that sin is allowed by God to exercise power temporarily. And that's a very different way of thinking, and I think it's important. So I think we need to continue to develop the conversations with theologians that are happening already, both for the theologian's sake and for the Pauline scholars' sake, to nuance these things. Martin's language of invasion has been criticized because it seems to imply, and the discontinuity emphases in apocalyptic readers can imply, that God was not already present and working in the world before Jesus came. And so those become Christological and theological questions as well. So those are examples of ongoing clarification that needs to happen in regards to temporal understandings of apocalyptic, spatial understandings, sin and salvation, forensic and cosmological notions. All of that need much further conversation. I think also we could further clarify and develop very interesting conversations within the New Testament as a whole, bringing Paul into conversation with other first, second century Christians, rather than just reading him in a bounded way. That doesn't mean taming him or making him agree with everybody else, which would not happen, but it means bringing those conversations, I think, to bear. And I think a third way is to bring this discussion, this whole kind of school almost now of thought about Paul as an apocalyptic preacher, into conversation with the ways the word apocalyptic gets used in our culture, which is all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not simply sort of in one sect of American Christianity and Christianity around the world that emphasizes the end of the world, but just apocalyptic means to stop dystopia. Apocalyptic is a very negative word
Mm-hmm.
in the press, and it's all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Apocalyptic discourse, apocalyptic this, apocalyptic that. And
Mm-hmm.
we've had very little kind of interaction between this apocalypse is good news in Paul and that discourse. And so how might the way of seeing that we learn from Paul give us new ways of talking in our culture? I think that's a really interesting topic that somebody out there should really jump on.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. Okay. Well, I mean, you mentioned the sort of the dichotomies that Pauline Apocalyptic tends to sort of erect. So I mean, what would you sort of attribute sort of this tendency to sort of produce dichotomies or to think in dichotomies? What would you attribute that to as far as apocalyptic scholarship? Like, is that owing to sort of the Protestant influence? Is that owing to the role of sort of Barth in these conversations, or where do you see sort of the source of this kind of tendency?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. Well, I do think that academic discourse tends to be polemical.
Yeah, yeah,
And I think Paul tends to be polemical. So you put that together and you get this way of talking.
yeah,
I mean, people build careers by defining their thought over against somebody else's thought.
yeah, for sure.
So I do think that that does influence these discussions. And that's where a critical step back could be useful and can be useful. And sometimes there are people who do that admirably. Um, so that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, to in order to clarify something, one tends to find a foil,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
then that
Yeah.
foil gets reified as an opposite point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to kind of go through that and come back and nuance more.
Yeah.
I would say that. I would say that there is one thing I worry about with some emphases on apocalyptic in Paul is a tendency to sound triumphalist. Um, I don't think that's necessarily the case, but uh, but I think humility is an important corrective to
Mm-hmm.
this dichotomous way of thinking.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and then as far as your own work, what have you sort of tried to contribute to conversation around Pauline Apocalyptic? Like, how have you tried to advance those conversations?
Well, because my interest has always been in questions on the ground, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
how people change, how people stay the same, uh, how the gospel intersects with real human lives here and now. So that means that my work has tended to be interested in the anthropological aspects of Paul's thought, which I do think were neglected for a long time, kind of in a reaction against Bultmann, maybe, but now are getting more attention. So what my work has done is try to take um, the apocalyptic readings of Paul and put them in conversation with notions of the person and personhood, and find interesting points of intersection between those usually kept apart realms of conversation or
Mm-hmm.
discourse. And so, that that ranges from thinking of persons as constituted in relationship rather than being bounded individuals, and thinking about how that makes a difference in how we think about sin and salvation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thinking also about the impetus for change as coming from outside, from God, who operates internal to the self, but is never reducible to the self or to human beings, obviously. Does not evolve out. That's quite a different way of thinking than what dominates in our culture, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So those are examples, I think. I would say that's where my contribution is strongest.
Yeah.
I've also, obviously, I wrote Incarnation and Apocalypse, where
Mm-hmm.
I really looked at the link in my mind between these apocalyptic readings of Paul and the theme of Christ's incarnation. And that, I think that's a contribution, because that wasn't much talked about. And yet, I think theologically they're very bound together.
Sure. So yeah, so you were a pastor for many years before you entered the academy, right?
Right. Yeah.
So do you find yourself sort of calling on that experience or drawing on that experience in your scholarship, or do you like the emphases on sort of anthropological questions? Does that emerge from sort of your experience pastoring, or are there links, would you say?
Sure, of course. I think the questions we bring to our work are necessarily ingredient in our lives. I will tell doctoral students who are thinking about what to write about, listen to your life.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to the questions that arise out of your life. So for me, the questions that arose out of pastoral experience were questions I brought to academic work. And what was interesting to me in New Testament was that those questions, which seemed to me to be incredibly obvious, would be refreshing and new. Because
Sure.
the academic guild, tends to have all the windows shut and just have a closed room conversation. The air gets stale.
Yeah.
They seem to be there is a tendency to have a conversation among scholars, debating each other's points. But there's this whole world out there that is so interesting. So I think that my questions very consciously come from trying to see what the difference the gospel makes in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a refreshing angle to operate out of.
Yeah.
I'm unabashed about that.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Not everybody
Okay, so
is.
you're sort of tiptoeing into this already, but so in your own work, you are sort of, like you said, bringing discussions of the apocalyptic Paul to bear on kind of life in the church, and especially, like you said, what sort of human transformation looks like in kind of an ecclesial setting, in sort of the church community setting. So what does Pauline Apocalyptic contribute to our understanding of how Christians are formed in community?
Yeah, I wrote a lot about that in a way in my first book on recovering Paul's mother tongue,
Mm-hmm.
on Galatians. That's where I first tackled this, and ended up attacking a lot of the dichotomies that I've already mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the first thing would be to say that it frames Christian community within the larger context of God's liberation of the world, so that the kingdom of God is not defined by the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, means that the church is porous and incomplete at all times, because we await the final revelation and the final consummation. And that the membership of the church is not complete, because God is not limited to the church and God's work in the world. The church didn't exist when Christ came into the world.
Yeah.
or died on the cross or was resurrected.
Yeah.
So Christ's solidarity is with the entire human race. And so that really, and Käsemann was really strong on this. One of the many things I learned from Käsemann in part. So that means that the church needs to have a certain humility about its identity and not, there are these hymns that say, I love thy kingdom, Lord, the place of thine abode, and then goes on to talk about church architecture. This is just not right. This is not the way it is. So this openness and this expectation that God is still at work in all creation. And of course, especially that the full redemption of Israel keeps the church from thinking it's complete in and of itself. Mm-hmm. So that is the apocalyptic expectation, I would say, does, in my mind, create a kind of eschatological reservation, to use that term that's debated, but it means that we just are not complete yet, nor can we be. And that means that we learn to live with a lack of resolution. And that creates room in the church and in the community of the church for mutual acceptance rather than a kind of perfectionism that casts out those who are different and creates a false unity based on conformity. Knowing that we are not complete in ourselves as individuals or as communities, nor should we be, is actually a very healthy, life-giving thing. That's part of it. Part of it is this grace, which to me is the gift that God continually has given and gives in Christ. That means that our identity is grounded in gift rather than in achievement. A simple thing, but one that churches tend not to preach because they like to talk about how great we are as a church. And that just doesn't quite get at the room to name that we are not great, but yet we are still God's. So that is another huge aspect of how people change in the church. And it is having an identity that is grounded in gift and expressed by giving that gift of undeserved, unmerited love to one another. And that is grounded in the future and drawn into the future, not grounded in the past. All of these have huge implications, and those are apocalyptic themes. The church is not defined by its glorious past, but by what God is doing and will do now and in the future. Those are some examples of what I sometimes call apocalyptic pastoral care. I have thought about writing a book with that title, but I'm not doing it yet.
Okay. That sounds delightful. No, yeah, I think that's beautifully said. And I like, you quote in one of your, I read parts of your two books, and I can't remember which one it's from, but you quote Rowan Williams, who talks about the church as a network of saving relationships or something like that. And I really like that sort of imagery. Okay, so
Williams also says, my health is not in thinking that I am at one with myself. That's also, both of those are in Recovering Paul's Mother Tongue. Okay. And that's part of this theme that he says we live in change, that is time, and exchange, that is relationship. So that's part of being part of a network of saving relationship. We are not complete in ourselves. We are not at peace in ourselves. We are not resolved in ourselves. This is not what mental health looks like. That's quite a profound thing to say, because we are always connected with others and changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so J. Lewis Martyn is someone that you speak really highly of in your work, but you also offer some kind of, I would say, gentle pushback to the sort of elements of his thinking, and one you've alluded to already, which is his language of sort of invasion, and you kind of nuance that by returning to a language of incarnation when you're talking about the Christ event. So what's sort of the distinction you're drawing here between these two terms?
Well, invasion, I think I said this is in an article, Apocalypse and Incarnation. Invasion implies a rescue mission, as I put it, of, like some ninja-like figures dropping into the place where people are enslaved and victoriously and maybe violently releasing them. Incarnation means Christ comes in to that place and so fully identifies with us that he dies on the cross. So, and of course, Martyn would agree with that, and always emphasize the cross as the revelation of Christ. So I'm not, but the nuance to me is that well, there are two things. One, incarnation shows, in a sense, how hidden and the revealing and liberating power of God are in Christ, and Christ's full solidarity with us in a way that invasion does not, to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the second, of course, is the theological point that the God was already in the world. God has never been absent from the world. But the incarnation is the climax and the full enactment of God's solidarity with the world. But it's preached in the prophets, and it's preached in God's revelation to Israel. So that was what was at stake for me in that. But where I always am in continuity with Lou, where I think the consistent thing in apocalyptic is that everything is, as Barth would have put it, apotuthu, from God. Mm-hmm. That the line of movement is from God to us, so that we are not climbing the ladder to become like God, but God has become like us and joined in solidarity with us. Incarnation also, of course, Morna Hooker has talked about this, puts the emphasis is still on the cross and resurrection, but the identity of Jesus as fully human as well as divine is crucial in every sense of the word to the redemptive power of the cross and the resurrection. Mm-hmm. And so incarnation highlights that. It's not Paul's language a lot, but I think he assumes it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Answering your dealing with
it definitely is. I think that I picked up on that in your chapter from the book we published on. It's I know the subtitle is With and Beyond J. Lewis Martyn, and it's edited by.
Right, that's the Apocalypse and Incarnation.
Okay.
Chapter in that book.
Yeah.
That's why I talk about that.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't say this, but it was my favorite chapter of the ones that are.
There are other good chapters in that book.
Yeah. It's a delightful collection. Okay. So turning to sort of contemporary figures, you mentioned a few names earlier, but who would you say are some sort of contemporary figures that are active in the field now in apocalyptic Paul scholarship that you think their work is especially promising? And then what about their work is impressive to you?
I'll name some Pauline scholars that I think are especially promising.
Okay.
And then I'll talk about that rather than categorizing in the first. I'm a little wary of these categories because that tends to foreshorten in a way or get in the way, short circuit full engagement with people's work sometimes. So I think, and this is your next question about a good book, if you want to familiarize yourself with Pauline Apocalyptic. I do think that Jamie Davies' new book is just really clear and really helpful. And I think what he's doing in the kind of nuancing and engagement he's modeling are really good, really helpful. So I would say that. And I'm curious to see what he does next. And Jervis has new work coming out on Paul and time, and I'm eager to see that because, again, whether we call this apocalyptic school or not, it's engaging with the questions of Paul and time, which people in the quote-unquote apocalyptic school, I never know if I'm in or out of that, but I don't worry about that too much. She's offering some new readings on the topic of time and Paul, which I think will be very important. Lisa Bowens' work, which really engages with Jewish apocalyptic thought and questions of conflict and battle and epistemology, but also questions of race, I think is really important. And I'm eager to see where she's going with that. Those are the first people that come to my mind. Of course, Doug Herink and various other theologians are continuing to think about Paul and Paul in relationship to politics. So that I would also add. Those are some off the top. There's, of course, I'm looking forward to others. I'm looking forward to Alexander Brown's commentary on First Corinthians and Beverly Gaventa's commentary on Romans, for example, among others. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. So you may have already answered, or at least answered in part, the following question, which is, are there sort of any particular books or articles you would recommend people start with if they're new to Pauline Apocalyptic? Where would you recommend folks start? Maybe Davies, that's where I started, his new book with us on the Apocalyptic Paul. But are there other places as well that you would recommend?
I would recommend there's an essay by Jonathan Linebaugh, who would not probably call himself Apocalyptic Paul, but I think he's an excellent New Testament scholar, and he does have an essay. Let me see if it's in this book. Yeah, in the Word of the Cross, Reading Paul, Jonathan Linebaugh, excellent essays. There's one in there where he takes Kasemann to task for starting with a schema of Jewish apocalyptic as predating Paul and as giving us the framework within which to understand Paul. And Davies says, no, we have to start with Paul's preaching and Paul's letters, and then understand what apocalyptic is from that standpoint. So it's an excellent little essay. I recommend that. Let me get the title for you. It is called Debating Debt. Well, I'm not sure. It might be Debating Diagonal Dikaiosune. But anyway, it's in here, and I recommend, or it might be The Death of Christ is the definition of the righteousness of God. Yeah, the death of Christ is the apocalypse of God's righteousness. So that's, I think, these are really interesting readings engaging with Jewish apocalyptic thought and texts a lot. So I would put that out there. I also should name my colleague, Douglas Campbell, who continues to very much write from an apocalyptic Pauline standpoint in his own particular way. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, but that's what makes life interesting. So I'll put his work out there. And then I would put the edited volume by Doug Herink. And let me see if I've got it here. I think I have all these right behind my head.
Okay.
Apocalyptic, the Future of Theology. I'll put that one out there too. There we go.
And that's the one. That's the one we just mentioned. Yeah.
Right, because you had Doug on your show. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another great collection for starters.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Okay. I want to give you a chance to talk about your book, Recovering Paul's Mother Tongue, since the second edition of it just came out fairly recently. with us at Cascade, which we were very pleased and honored to be publishing the second edition. So for those who haven't read it, for our listeners who haven't read it, could you just maybe kind of quickly summarize what you're up to in that book?
Yeah, I wrote that a long time ago, but the second edition has a couple of extra essays at the end, appendices. Another, while I'm at this, before I go on to that, Martyn de Boer has a collection of essays called Paul, Theologian of God's Apocalypse, and which are excellent. And he is so characteristically very, very clear and even-handed. I think he's an excellent introduction also to the issues in reading Paul apocalyptically. So that's another great one. I'm going to put that out there and give credit for Martyn de Boer.
Thank you.
It's really important. And what made me think of him is he wrote the foreword for the second edition of Recovering Paul's Mother Tongue. So Recovering Paul's Mother Tongue wrestles with Galatians 4, a section of Galatians 4 that gets has less attention, where Paul talks about himself as being in labor with the Galatians, and then talks about, so in a feminine image, and then also talks about the Hagar and Sarah story and Jerusalem as a mother. So what that book does is wrestle with questions of human transformation and continuity in relationship to these feminine images in Paul, because I wanted to give attention, that's why I say mother tongue, I wanted to give attention to those feminine images. Beverly Gaventa has done some of that. Lou Martin has done some of that, others also. But I'm looking at how Paul uses this feminine language both to talk about the sustenance of believers over time, as well as their genesis in the gospel. And so I'm very much interested in these questions about the continuity and discontinuity of identity. So that's what that does. It looks at those feminine images within their context in the prophets, and where the prophets use images of God as a woman in labor. And I talk about God, this feminine image of God in labor. And also it looks at the language and portrayal of Jerusalem as a mother city and mother cities in Jewish apocalyptic literature, and the function of those in giving hope, and how Paul utilizes that image, which he gets from Isaiah, and transforms it. So the end of that is to begin to think in fresh ways about how the grace and gift of God create newness and yet sustain us over time in the church. So I talk about the gospel creating a history. That's my engagement with Martyn, for whom there almost is no history. But he does use that term. The gospel creates a history. So I talk about creating a history as creating a community and a network of saving relation. That's kind of a rambling thing. I hope that's helpful, but you can ask.
No, that is very helpful. Yeah, I like I said, I got to read the introduction kind of in prepping for an interview, and it made me. I'll give a little bit of a confession. It made me want to find time and space to read more of your work, because I really enjoyed it. And the trick, of course, is, as you know, being probably a voracious reader yourself, is finding space in the list of to read.
But so I will put the plug in. This is Whip and Stock for the forthcoming collection of essays, which includes Apocalypse and Incarnation and a bunch of others, with Whip and Stock. Cascade, in part of the Cascade library. It's in press.
And so, what's the tentative title of that one again?
Oh, it's Oneself in Another.
Yeah.
Participation and Personhood in Pauline Theology.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's about 10, 12 essays, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, we're very much looking forward to that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
happy to have it off my desk and
I'm sure.
press.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Grant Pascal was another really interesting New Testament scholar who would not necessarily call himself an apocalyptic reader of Paul, but who engages with apocalyptic Jewish texts in relationship to Paul in depth. He wrote the intro, the foreword, and his work also is, again, really valuable.
Yeah, I think he was Jamie Davies' doctoral supervisor as well. Yeah.
And he really looks at the intersection of Pauline theology and issues in human life as well, I think, in really interesting ways. It's important work.
Okay, so we'll wrap up with one final question, which is where or how can our listeners learn more about you and your work?
Well, they should read this book of forthcoming essays. I mean, I'm retired now from Duke. I sometimes go to conferences. Sometimes those are Zoomed. I will be at a conference actually in Toronto on apocalyptic, the heart of Paul's gospel, ? In Toronto in May. So this is timely. But I don't have a podcast or anything like that. So all I can say is I'm Googleable. And
yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. Jamie Davies sent me some information about that conference in Toronto. It looked like quite a stellar lineup of folks who are giving talks.
Yeah, it'll be fun. I'll say also I have a commentary on Romans coming out, but it's not done yet. So it'll be the interpretation series. So it's really for pastors.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Forward to that. Okay, well, thank you so much, Susan. I very much value you taking some time to chat with me this morning.
Thank you, Zach. Good to chat with you as well.
Thank you.